Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the AASHTO Reuniversity webinar series, Ready, Set, Go, How to Prepare for an AASHTO Resource On-Site Assessment. I'm Kim Swanson, the Communications Manager at AASHTO Resource, and I'll be acting as moderator today. Today, we're joined by Laboratory Assessment Program, Assistant Program Managers, Mike Wagner and Sonya Puterbaugh. I knew I was going to do it, Sonya. I'm so sorry. I messed up your name again every time.
It's like computer.
You know it, you say it, and I still don't get it. So I apologize for that, Sonya. But thank you, Sonya, for being here. Thank you, Mike, for being here. And take it away, Sonya.
Thank you, Kim. Don't worry, it's a tough last name. It's computer, like a computer, Puterbaugh. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us for this webinar about how to prepare for an AASHTO resource assessment. So today, this webinar is going to help you identify key documents and information that should be sent to AASHTO resource prior to the assessment. It will help you locate information on the AASHTO resource website to assist in preparation activities, and it will help you understand what will occur during an AASHTO resource assessment. Okay, so let's start with what happens prior to an assessment. And here's a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this section and a rough timeline of when each event occurs in relation to your assessment date. So we're going to go over the assessment tour and when to expect us. We're going to go over requesting an assessment, scheduling the assessment, what pre-assessment documentation is required to be submitted, assembling the quality records that you're going to need for the assessment itself, and sample preparation. And as we go through the pre-assessment preparation slides here, keep an eye in the top right-hand corner. The time at which this step occurs in relation to your assessment will be up there. So let's start with the estimated assessment schedule and when to expect us. Currently, just a little bit of background, we have over 2,000 laboratories in our assessment program, and every single one of these laboratories needs an assessment approximately every 2 years. So in order to accomplish this huge feat, we conduct assessments in a sweeping wave across the country, starting on the East Coast, ending on the West Coast. You might have heard that we sometimes call this a tour. Scheduling assessments this way means that we typically work kind of state by state. We try and wrap up the more eastern states before moving too far west. So for example, that means that we're going to begin assessments in Kansas a few weeks or months before we begin them in Colorado. Of course, I'm sure some of you in the audience might experience this, but there are some exceptions to this rule. If your laboratory is located in certain areas, you might actually have an assessor that lives near you and can do assessments continuously. So you might not quite be on the same schedule as everybody else. But that's okay because we have some tools to help figure out when your area is going to be assessed. So in order to figure out where we're currently performing assessments, as well as where we're about to be performing assessments, you can visit our website to see this estimated assessment schedule. You can view it as a map or as a written schedule. We update this pretty regularly, so it's usually up to date and quite accurate. Okay, so let's say your laboratory is in an area that falls into that right column, the upcoming assessments category, like Alaska or Idaho. What happens next? Well, approximately 4 to 6 months before we expect to be in your area, we will send you an email asking you to submit an assessment request. Once you receive that email, or honestly at any time if you need an assessment urgently, then you can request an assessment by going to your laboratory's homepage and clicking on that green Request an Assessment button under Laboratory Assessment History there. After that, you'll simply walk through the request form, selecting all of the quality system standards and test methods that your laboratory needs. Okay, so you've successfully requested an AASHTO resource assessment. What happens next? After you submit the request for an assessment, you just need to wait a little bit to hear from us again. We will select the dates for your assessment, and approximately 4 to 6 weeks before those dates, we will contact you again by sending you an email with an attached assessment announcement letter. This announcement letter will let you know some very important pieces of information, including the date of your upcoming assessment, who your assessor is going to be, and how long we expect that assessment to take. Once you receive that letter, it's very important to read it over carefully and make sure that you note down the dates and to share it with anybody else in your laboratory that will be involved in the assessment. However, we do understand that sometimes we pick dates for your assessment that simply, for whatever reason, do not work. Whatever the case, contact us as soon as possible if you need to cancel or postpone your assessment for any reason, and keep in mind that there may be a fee associated with canceling your assessment. So the reason that we need to know as soon as possible is because we are trying to minimize costs by scheduling groups of labs in 2 and 3 week trips. Remember, we have over 2,000 labs in our program. So when labs cancel, especially very close to the assessment date, that may mean we're not able to complete that full scheduled trip. So let us know as soon as possible if the dates we selected don't work. For more information about our cancellation and postponement policy, please visit our fees page. So soon after you receive that announcement letter letting you know that your assessment is imminent, your assessor will contact you directly, usually by phone. Your assessor will go over some details of the assessment with you at this point. They're going to confirm that the quality system standards and test methods that you selected a few months ago are still correct. And they'll also iron out some small details like when to start the assessment and confirm your address. And if you're having a remote assessment, they'll also set up a time and date to perform a dry run with you. And lastly, they'll answer any questions that you have about your upcoming assessment. So after speaking with your assessor, you are ready to gather and submit the documents that you are required to submit before the assessment begins. We often call these pre-assessment documents. So here's where things get just a little bit tricky though, because the documents required and their associated deadlines are a little bit different between a remote assessment and an on-site assessment. As a result, we're going to go through those separately. We're going to start with remote assessments because currently we are still only conducting remote assessments. And the required pre-assessment documentation is very easy. Before your assessment, we only require that you upload the technician matrix. This document is a document where you can put in all of the laboratory supervisors and testing technicians. You send that into your assessor so that your assessor can see who is going to be performing testing during the assessment. However, though it's not required, it is highly recommended that you also submit as much of your quality related documentation as possible. Remember, only the technician matrix is required, but this is highly recommended. This includes the quality manual and all associated records, such as the equipment records, technician training and evaluation records, internal audits, management reviews, and so on. Anything that is not uploaded before the assessment will have to be reviewed during the remote assessment itself. And there are definitely some key advantages to uploading this documentation before the assessment begins. These advantages include that there'll be less back and forth with the assessor, which leads to an increased efficiency during the assessment, which may in turn lead to a cost savings for the laboratory since these assessments are invoiced based on the time they take to complete. Okay, so once you have all of your documents gathered and you're ready to upload them, what you need to do is go to your laboratory homepage under Laboratory Assessment History and click another green button, the green Pre-Assessment button on your homepage, which will be associated with the specific assessment. You'll be directed to this page here, where you can upload up to 5 files totaling 100 megabytes or less. It is recommended that you compress your files into a zip or an RAR file in order to meet the size limit here. For more guidance on exactly what records I'm talking about, you can go here on our website. We have a remote assessment documentation guide, and it's there just to help you figure out exactly what documents you must submit. And just a little preview of what that looks like. When you open up the remote assessment documentation guide, this is the first page you'll be directed to, and all you need to do is click which option of the 5 listed here applies to your lab. For example, if you, like the majority of our customers, are required to have this assessment as part of our regular tour, you just click the blue box titled Regular In-Sequence Assessment, and it will direct you to this page. So this page lists the minimum required documents in order to schedule your assessment, which again, just the matrix, and listed below are all of the highly recommended documents. You can just go through here and check it out and check them as you compile them. So looking at this list of recommended documents, it may seem a little bit overwhelming, but keep in mind that these documents have to be evaluated at some point during the assessment. So remember all those key advantages we had talked about before. And while we're talking about things that only apply to remote assessments, let's very quickly touch on the dry run. After it's determined that your pre-assessment documents are good to go, we will schedule and perform a dry run. So this is conducted using video streaming software, something like Zoom. And during the dry run, the assessor will request a tour of the full testing area. This allows the assessor to understand the layout of the laboratory and to see the types of equipment that will be used during the remote assessment. In addition, the assessor will be able to evaluate the audio and video quality to ensure that the laboratory has sufficient equipment and internet access to support high quality audio and video. Again, the assessor will discuss the remote assessment schedule. Make sure you discuss this a little bit on the phone beforehand, but again, we'll make sure that it still is working for you. And then the dry run can go one of two ways. If it doesn't go very well, if we're having some internet issues or some video or audio issues, you can try again and we can schedule another assessment in a week and give you a chance to fix any issues. If we still can't fix the issues, we just won't move forward with the remote assessment. We'll have to discuss alternative options. But if the dry run, the first one or the rescheduled one goes well, then we'll proceed. Okay, so back to document submittal. So we're going to move on to document submittal for on-site assessments. And some of you watching today are probably very familiar with on-site assessments, as well as what documentation we have required prior to on-site assessments in the past, which was generally nothing. We didn't ask you for any documentation in the past. However, we've used this time off of the road to make some much needed improvements and updates to our assessment processes. Some of these improvements are still being worked out right now, so this next section is a little bit of a sneak peek for everybody here today. So when we're back on site, we're actually going to start requiring a few things before the assessment, before we actually travel and arrive at your lab. We're going to require the laboratory's current quality manual, so that includes all of the policies and procedures for all elements of the laboratory's quality management system. We're going to require a current organizational chart, the PE information for the laboratory's technical director, or the ATG approval number for a non-PE, and optionally technician certifications for the ASTM quality system standards, C1077, D3666, D3740, and E329. And with these documents, there will be a hard deadline of 2 weeks before the start of your on-site assessment to have this documentation uploaded. So laboratories that do not upload their documentation by the deadline will be charged an additional fee. And to submit the on-site pre-assessment documentation, it's pretty similar to the remote assessment. You will click on the green pre-assessment button on your laboratory's homepage, but it will take you somewhere new or familiar, actually. It will take you to the accreditation events page, which for some of you will look very familiar because this is the same portal that you use now to respond to any nonconformities noted on your assessment report. On this page, you will have dedicated space to upload all of the pre-assessment documentation. So like I mentioned just now, we're still working out some of the new policies and procedures for on-site assessment, pre-assessment documentation submittal, and we will update you when we finalize the new process. So please keep an eye out for more communication from us in the future. So that's everything that you need to know about pre-assessment documentation submittal. You guys are experts now. So let's move on to gathering the rest of the documents and records that we're going to review during the assessment. Mike will touch on this a little bit more later in the presentation, but before the assessment, you're going to want to spend some time compiling all of the records that your assessor is going to need to review. So compiling all of this documentation is actually pretty time consuming, so I recommend that you start doing it a few weeks before the assessment. This includes the equipment calibration, standardization, or check records, the training and competency evaluation records for all laboratory staff, and other documents like the internal audits, the management reviews, and the quality manual if you hadn't uploaded it beforehand. That's 2 weeks before the assessment. And lastly, the last thing you're going to do a week before your assessment is you're going to want to prepare all of the samples that you will use to demonstrate each test method that you've signed up for. I don't know how many times I've told this to labs, but sample preparation is absolutely the key to a smooth assessment. When all of your samples are prepared and staged ahead of time, there ends up being very little time wasted during the assessment. And because we charge for our assessment on a time-based system, any time that you save is cost savings for your lab. You can find the sample preparation lists for every scope on our website. And here's what the lists look like. The test method is listed on the left, and then guidance on how to prepare the sample is on the right. But if you have any specific questions about sample preparation, or honestly anything at all about your upcoming assessment, you are free to contact your assessor at any time. And now that you're all experts in pre-assessment preparation, Mike is going to take over from here and talk about what happens during the assessment.
All right, thanks, Sonia. So there was a lot of work that goes into getting ready for the assessment. And I want to kind of talk about what goes on during assessment and how all of that work applies to what happens during the assessment. So a quick summary of the assessment process: we have the opening meeting, the test method demonstration, apparatus checks, the QMS review, the closing meeting, and then you'll get your final report shortly after that. And we'll go into kind of each of these steps a little more in depth as we go through. So as far as the opening meeting goes, it's the first setup situation you have with your assessor. It's recommended that everyone who's going to be involved with the assessment is available for this meeting. It can be as formal as you would like it. We do like to, have as many people there as possible so there's no questions later on. That can be, laboratory manager, the PE, supervisors. The quality manager is great to have there because as we go through the assessment, it's good to make sure they're aware of when we're going to be looking at some of the quality documents. Also the laboratory technicians, it's great to have everyone there. This is the time where we're going to review the scope. We're going to sit down and show you the request form and go over each of the tests to make sure that we're going to be assessing you for the test that you want to be accredited for. We'll go over any tests that you might want to drop or add. We can also do that as the assessment goes on, but this is a great time to kind of catch those things. We can be like, oh no, I forgot to add this test, or oh no, I definitely don't want to drop this test. I don't want to lose my accreditation for that. Good time to go over the logistics as well. Can set out a kind of a schedule for when you're going to perform each test. Go over technician availability. If you have a field technician who's going to be doing sand cone, it's a good idea to kind of figure out a time for that if they're only available at certain times during the day, or beginning of the day, end of the day, or if they're going to be in between jobs, around lunchtime. That way your assessor can kind of plan for that and make sure that's not being smashed in at the end of the day. It's also a good time to talk about any breaks or figure out what time you want to end each day. And then some general housekeeping. We go over our confidentiality policy, go over any safety briefings, make sure there's any PPE that we don't have. All of our assessors are going to be wearing safety glasses and steel-toed shoes. But if there's anything that you require beyond that, to make sure to go over that with the assessors. It's also a good time to go do a quick tour of the laboratory. I've been lost a few times in some of the bigger buildings. So it's a good time to kind of go through that. And, everybody wants to know where the bathroom is. So it's a good time to find that out as well. So Sonia kind of touched on the test method demonstration. This is a great time to really emphasize to have your samples prepared beforehand. There's much less downtime during the assessment. It's a quicker and smoother transition between tests. And since our assessments now are time-based, there's going to be a cost savings, right? Time is money. For the assessors kind of sitting around waiting for technicians to prep samples. That's more time that we're going to do what we can. We're going to go check equipment, check paperwork if we can. But sometimes they're just kind of really sitting there twiddling their thumbs. And everyone always says that an idle inspector has more time to go find things. So the more prepped you are, the less time we have to look around. We do want to make sure that each test is performed basically to completion from the beginning to end. There are some tests, like the trialxyl test for soils that takes several days. We'll have to abbreviate those. But kind of going back into preparation, some of the tests like the ignition furnace, you can have kind of like a cooking show set up, basically put a cake in the oven, reach down below and pull out the finished cake. So you can have one sample that's warmed up, ready to be burned, a second sample that was already burned and ready to be washed, and then a third sample that was washed and dried and ready for the sieving portion of T30. So that saves a lot of time. That way we're not kind of waiting around again for those situations. Generally, there is no talking through a test. Like I said, we're there to watch you actually demonstrate the test. There are some situations where you're going to already have it prepped up according to those prep sheets that you should have a link for those in the chat now. It'll tell you exactly where to have the test set up to. So your assessor might say, hey, what did you do to prepare this? And you can talk through that. But again, this is all going to be something that you will communicate with your assessor. If there's a situation that you just need to talk through something because of a wait time or something like that, make sure that you're talking to your assessor and making sure that's okay before you just assume you can do it. First, our customers that are getting accredited for AASHTO and ASTM, your assessor will ask you the major differences. They're not expected to run one test for ASTM and then another test for AASHTO. So as you kind of go through the test, there might be certain times where they stop and say, oh, okay, if you were doing this for ASTM, what would you do? Or something along those lines. And again, this isn't like a test or anything. I'm not here walking around with a roller smacking your knuckles if you get a question wrong or something. So you pay a lot of money for the AASHTO and the ASTM standards. Make sure you reference those if you're unsure about something, if you're asked a question. You can have any handwritten notes, any job aids, anything like that. It's definitely I can't memorize all this stuff either, so I don't expect anyone else to. And then at the end of each test, your assessor will discuss any findings that they noted during the demonstration. That way, there's no surprises. Nobody likes these type of surprises. So they should discuss this with you at the end of each test, and you can kind of talk about it. Make sure both of you are in agreement of what happened during the test demonstration. So we're also going to check equipment. For those of you that have had CSRL inspections, but not one through resource yet, we carry a lot less equipment, but we still carry a good bit. It's more basically like the size of a standard suitcase. We have things like calipers, digital or standardized masses, thermometers. And we're going to do this. It's really kind of each assessor does it slightly differently. Again, this is something that you should communicate with your assessor at that opening meeting. Some assessors do it right after each test demonstration. Some do it during some downtime. Some take some breaks and go check a few tests at a time as far as equipment goes. Some people do it after all the testing's complete. Like I said, everyone's different. There's no wrong or right way to do it necessarily. Just make sure that your assessor communicates that with you clearly. Continuing with the equipment checks, we do a sampling of the equipment. So if you have 10 proctor molds sitting on a shelf, we're going to check several of those molds, not just the one that was used during the testing demonstration. So it's a good time to make sure you have your equipment clean and available. I have no problem cleaning a proctor mold, but again, these are time-based assessments. So, make sure that those are done, because in order for me to get an accurate measurement, it does have to be clean. And also during these equipment checks, we're going to record serial numbers. That way, when the assessor is checking the equipment calibration or standardization records at some point, they can kind of cross-reference, okay, I saw proctor mold 13. I'm going to see a record for that. And then for the quality management system review, kind of a quick recap here. There were some things that are going to be submitted before the assessment: the quality manual, the PE information or ATG approval, the org chart. Any changes that were made after you submitted those documents, maybe as far as the org chart, some top management have left and you brought new people in. Make sure to let the assessor know about that so they can check it when they're there. A big thing to remember is that any findings that were noted during the desktop audit cannot be resolved during the assessment. We've actually have stopped doing any type of resolutions during the assessment. And we're going to continue with that. So if you send something in and the assessor reviews it, when they get to your laboratory for the on-site assessment, they're going to discuss the findings that they noted. And it's really just an opportunity for you to discuss that. It's not a chance to change anything. Now, if there was a situation where it's, a procedure was missing that's kept in an appendix somewhere and they tell you, hey, I didn't see this, but you can go and pull it out of a file cabinet or pull it off your computer desktop real fast. That's not going to be a finding. That's understandable. But we're not expecting we don't allow people to type up a new procedure or policy or anything like that. And the costs associated with the pre-assessment are included in the base fee. So that's why it is important to make sure you submit as much as you can up front, because that base fee is being charged regardless. So it's a little bit of a cost savings there for everyone. And as far as during the assessment, we're going to check everything that basically wasn't sent in during the pre-assessment. So we're going to look at all the equipment records, some of the calibration, standardization, and check procedures for each piece of equipment, the internal audit and management review records, test reports. Again, anything that just wasn't included in that initial pre-assessment. And then the time spent reviewing this documents during the assessment is included, and it's going to be inputted. It's going to be added into the time spent during the assessment, and you'll be invoiced for that time. And there should be some links for what our fees are. The closing meeting, again, is kind of the same slide we saw for the opening meeting. It's important to have everyone who was involved in the assessment there. That way, any questions can be answered in a timely manner. The assessor is going to sit down with you, go over the report, and talk about all the findings again. Again, there shouldn't be any surprises from the testing demonstration, as that should have been all discussed before, but it's a good time. Maybe your lab manager wasn't there during the test, and I can give them an opportunity to ask any questions. I mentioned this, your assessor is going to prepare a preliminary report. They're going to discuss the findings, and then they're going to go back, and your report's going to be peer reviewed by someone else on the assessment staff. And if there's any questions or anything, that there may be some small adjustments. Maybe a finding would be removed because it wasn't applicable, or after further discussion. But you'll get your final report in approximately 3 to 4 weeks, and there's typically not a whole lot of changes, but just be aware there could be some. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to type them into the Q&A.
Thank you, Mike. We do have some questions, so let me get going here, finding some questions for everyone. And again, you should be able to type them in the Q&A bar tab at the bottom of the screen. So we're going to just start at the top. We do have a few questions right now, but Sonya, Tara wants to know, are the timelines that you gave specific to remote assessments, or do they apply to on-site assessments as well?
They do apply to both. So the timelines they can be a little rough timelines. I was giving kind of ranges there, 4 to 6 months. We'll ask you to submit an assessment request. You'll hear about your assessment timelines in 4 to 6 weeks. That applies to both remote and on-site.
Thank you. A question for you, Mike, specifically about the tour. Kyle would like to know if we have an idea of when we're going to be back in Canada.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm thinking sometime at the end of this year, beginning of next year, end of 2021, early 2022. As far as whether it's going to be remote or on-site, very, very TBD.
Yes. So, and again, the LAP/schedule has some of that information, but it can be tricky. If you have questions about your specific state, you can always email info@ashtoresource.org as well, and they'll be able to help get the answer to that. So. And Sonya, regarding the remote assessments, can Microsoft Teams be used instead of Zoom?
It sure can.
Yes. And Mike, Brendan wants to know, what is ATG approval that was mentioned a couple times? And can a professional geologist license be a substitute for a PE?
That's a great question. Yeah, ATG approval, the ATG is the administrative task group that oversees what we do at AASHTO Resource here. And they're the ones, it's a group of state DOT representatives that kind of make these decisions. And you can apply for this. You can talk to your quality analyst about it, as far as the details, what's acceptable, as for substituting that for a PE, as far as being accredited laboratory. There are some very specific requirements for the ASTM quality standards that a PG might substitute for a PE, but it won't. You can't paint that with a broad brush for all of them.
Yeah. If you want to know more about the ATG in general, this week's podcast episode is specifically about the ATG, and I believe 2-3 weeks ago, season 2, episode 13 is about licensed PE requirements. So Brian Johnson with the AASHTO Accreditation and Program answers some FAQs around PE requirements too, if you want to go into a little more detail about that. So thank you. Sonya, are you still performing abbreviated assessments if the last time was a full scope assessment?
This is a great question. So I'm assuming that, Lev, you're talking about if you got a remote assessment for your initial accreditation assessment. So if you read our policy and guidance document on remote assessments, there was a section in there that said, hey, if this is your first assessment, you're getting accredited for the first time with us using a remote assessment. In approximately a year, what we're going to do is we're going to visit you on site and do an abbreviated assessment. I know that now for some of you who are some of our first customers, a year has come and gone, and we still are not back on site. But currently, that is still our plan to visit those laboratories who had their initial assessment remote, to visit them on site with an abbreviated assessment. And that's kind of where we're going from here. Is we have to start kind of figuring out the scheduling and logistics of that. Like I mentioned in the presentation, eventually we are going to get back out on the road when it's safe to do so. And so some of the first places that we want to visit are those labs that had their initial assessment remotely. Good question.
Thank you. Someone else asked, Mike, we initially submitted all of our documents with our assessment request in April. Will we need to submit those documents again?
No, they won't have to submit it again unless there was any major changes, as far as any documents that were changed at that point. So no, they should be good.
Okay. Now, Sonya, it seems like a specific question, so stay with me here. Patricia said, we applied for an assessment in May of this year and were told it would not happen until March of 2020. I thought you said we would be reminded to apply 4 to 6 months ahead of time. This is a 10-month lead time? Question mark.
I can actually, if it's okay, I'll answer this one.
Go for it, Mike.
Thank you. So yeah, this can be confusing. Some of our very large states that it might take us, 8 months to complete an assessment in that state. We don't really have the technology, I guess the IT capabilities right now to do the canvassing in very small groups. So we kind of canvass the whole state all at once. So if you were assessed last in your state for the last tour, you're going to be at the very end of that assessment again. So there can be big lead times, unfortunately. When we canvass each state, we're saying, hey, we're going to be assessing in your area in 4 to 6 months, but your actual assessment could actually be much longer than that.
Thank you for the clarification on that. Sherry wants to know if your lab equipment has been in use and had no prior calibration verification paperwork prior to signing up for an assessment, does a corrective action need to be made for said equipment, or will there be a non-conformity regardless? Sonya, do you want to take that?
Yes, and I'm going to answer it from the perspective that you're signing up for your first assessment. So previously, maybe nobody has been requiring that you have your equipment calibrated or standardized. So accreditation is really kind of the last step that you want to take. By the time you call us and say, we want to be accredited by AASHTO, you're telling us that, hey, we have gone through at a minimum R18, but any ASTM quality system standards you also need. We've gone through these, we've created written policies and procedures, and we've done everything they've required, including getting all of our equipment calibrated and standardized. And then we come in and check you against that. So if you're a first-time lab, unfortunately, we don't take it easy on you. We don't cut you a lot of slack with records. So we do expect you to have all of those records, even if it's your first time.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go back up to a question. I think we got a clarification on one of the questions that was previously asked regarding the abbreviated assessment. So I think that was for Sonya, you answered that. The original question was, are you still performing abbreviated assessments if your last time was a full scope? The clarification is, our next assessment is a remote assessment. So my question was about possible an abbreviated assessment since the last one was a full assessment. So are the remote assessments, is my interpretation of this question, are remote assessments abbreviated, or is it still the full scope of an on-site?
So no, the remote assessment will be a full assessment. And if it's your regular in sequence tour assessment, you don't have to do anything after that. It will count as, I think we're in tour 32, for example. It will count as your tour 32 assessment. You don't need to have another on-site assessment. We will hopefully see you on-site in 2 years for another full assessment as usual.
Fingers crossed. So hopefully, Lev, that clarifies it. If not, shoot another Q&A here and we'll get this figured out. Or you can email Mike or Sonya or info, and we can get that taken care of if this back and forth is maybe not the best. An anonymous attendee wanted to know, Mike, do all remote assessments, so all remote inspections, all hands-on testing will be performed through the camera, is the question.
Yeah. So there are several ways to do this, and I think we have some information on our website about some, helpful tips and hints as far as, how to set it up. Typically it's best to have another person there that can kind of hold the camera, whether it's a phone or a tablet of some sort, and kind of be the camera person. We've had someone that's just not available, so you have to use a tripod or a laptop that's set up. It works. It just takes a little bit of communication with you and the assessor to make sure it's set up in the right spot so the assessor can see what they need to.
Thank you for that. And I believe we go through a remote more in depth about what is a remote assessment and things like that in other webinars that we did earlier. So you may want to check those out on our YouTube page or on our video gallery on our website to have if you have very specific questions about remote assessments. That might be helpful if you're brand new to all of this. So thank you for that, Mike. Sonya, this next question is for you. We have submitted for our lab assessment, and we found we have a couple key people that are going to be out for certain dates. We have not heard back as to when the dates of our assessment will occur. What's the best way to contact resource to let her know, our assessor, about what is the preference of the days in and out for the assessment?
That is a great question, because we do, before we schedule, like I said, we choose the assessment dates, but we always like to hear about any dates before we even try and schedule, try and fit your lab into a 2-week trip. We like to know about any blackout dates for you. The best thing that you can do is, if you already know those dates, when you submit your assessment request, there's actually a space where you can put a few dates down and say, no one's going to be in this week because all of our technicians are out for training or something. But if you've already submitted your request, then feel free to call somebody at our office. You can also email info@ashtoresource.org. You can call Mike or myself. You can also call the senior assessor in charge of scheduling. And what we can do for you is we can add comments to your assessment request, letting assessors know, hey, please don't schedule the lab on these dates. Some key personnel are going to be out. Thank you very much for that, by the way. Letting us know upfront ahead of time if you have a couple days that it just will not work for you really reduces some of the headaches of scheduling.
Absolutely.
Mike, this next question is from you, from Sherry. She wants to know, what should I do if there's a staff change after I submit the documentation before the assessment?
Yeah, that's fine. Just talk to your assessor whenever they give you a call or send you an email. You can kind of wait to your schedule. You don't have to redo everything and send it in again. That's something that can be discussed, and your assessor will look at it when they're there for the on-site or remote assessment.
Thank you for that. Sonya, our next question is for you. Do we need to submit the last calibration, or do you want to see all the previous calibrations, or just the last 2 or 3 calibrations for equipment?
Oh, this is a great question. So for remote assessments and on-site assessments, we need to see all of the current calibrations and standardizations. Absolutely. We need to make sure that all of the equipment that we saw being used and all of the equipment in your lab is currently calibrated or standardized or checked. And then what we typically do is we go through and we do a spot check to make sure that you're following the intervals. So we'll pick a few pieces of equipment and we'll start looking at a couple years back and make sure, yes, you've done your sieves every 12 months for the last 3 or 4 years. We don't typically go back past the last assessment. So we do normally only check the last 2 years. On site, this is really easy because typically you have all your records together and we can just flip through a binder or a filing cabinet. Remote, it's a little bit more difficult. So we request that, yes, we need to be able to review on our computers. So email it to us, submit it to our website, all of the current calibrations. And then typically during the remote assessment, we'll say, hey, can you show me the last 2 years of your sieve record specifically for the number 4 sieve? We'll just start picking pieces of equipment and making sure that you're following the intervals. Good question.
Thank you for clarification on that. In a similar vein, Mike, do laboratories need to submit test reports for all the tests that they demonstrate?
No, that's a great question. No, you don't have to submit all of those. Your assessor will talk to you about the ones that they like to see. For the tests that you are being accredited for, they will need to see them at some point. I know a lot of our assessors will just do that. If it's a remote assessment, they'll do it during the assessment and just say, hey, can you either share your screen with me and show me the test reports, or you can send them in an email during the assessment, something along those lines.
Thank you. Okay, going back to the 10-month scenario where the scheduling of an assessment, Patricia had a follow-up question. She said, since my assessment is scheduled 10 months out, my blackout dates may change based on some staff issues. Will we be penalized for changing the date? If a tech has a baby, we may need to change the date.
You will absolutely not be penalized. It's totally understandable. Again, communication is key here. So just reach out to me, Sonya, or anyone at AASHTO Resource, and we'll make sure to get those dates changed for you. We're more than happy to do stuff like that. We understand that things change, and we appreciate you guys, staying on top of it.
I guess a small clarification there is if your assessment has been scheduled and it's on the books for a certain day and you wait until the week before the assessment to let us know, by the way, we need to change it, probably there will be some financial penalty. We might charge some fees there. So definitely tell us early. And but that's a good reason for needing to postpone an assessment.
Yeah, definitely. It's always earlier, the better to try to make that change. And again, as Sonya said, once an assessment has already been scheduled, there's a lot of moving pieces there that's kind of hard to untangle. But similar vein, an anonymous attendee asked if they could change the date of their AASHTO or CCRL assessment dates, because both our assessment dates are really close together because they're in Puerto Rico. So how, Mike, do you suggest that any guidance you can suggest in that scenario, that the CCRL inspection and the AASHTO resource assessment are going to be really close together for them?
Yeah, no, that's great information to have. Sometimes there is a little bit of a lack of communication between the two groups, and we don't want to make sure we get there too close together. So that's actually something I'll talk to the some other managers about to see what we can do and kind of get more information as far as when they're going to be there and when we're planning on being there, and we can work it out together, and we'll also work with the labs individually too. If you get scheduled for assessment, make sure to let us know, like, oh, hey, our CCRL is going to be here the very next week. Can we do something about this?
Yeah.
But we're going to try our best ahead of time to make sure we're not getting too close to that situation. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we understand how stressful an assessment can be, and to have it back to back with two back to back, I don't wish that on anybody. So I think we for sure do what we can within reason for those areas. We have a couple more questions, and we have time for a lot more time for questions. So if you have questions, please submit them. I'm going to quickly scan this question so I ask it correctly. So. All right, Sonya, going back to calibration records. So regarding a laboratory's first assessment and calibration records, if they have had their equipment calibrated, they may only have 1 or 2 calibration records. Will they be written up for not going back 5 years? So that's the first question. We're gonna ask that question. So will there be?
Okay. So no, so a first-time lab, we expect you to have all of your current calibration records. So everything that you're using, you should have a current record for. Because you haven't been previously accredited and you might have had no reason to get it calibrated in the R18 intervals, we certainly do not look back. So if it's your first time, we just make sure that you have current records. Yes, R18 does require that you keep technical records for a minimum of 5 years, but we can't hold a brand new lab to that. So we write an informational note on your report, which is a note that does not affect your accreditation at all. It is purely on your reports that you have a little bit of extra information, and it's actually confirming that you're a new lab. You do not have 5 years of records, and we do not expect you to, and that's okay.
And I think that was the answer to the follow-up question in that. So I think that's why I didn't ask at all, because I thought you were going to get there. So hopefully, Patricia, that answers your question. If not, type another one in. And we have this last question I'm not quite sure that I understand this question. So I'm going to say it, I'm going to see who gets it. We'll see what happens. And if I don't ask it correctly and it needs clarification, please type in if this is your question. So the question is, we recently had a CCRL assessment. The inventory includes concrete equipment too. Do we have to separate out concrete equipment?
I can jump in. It's a great question. The answer is no, you don't have to. The system that you have should work for you, for your laboratory. It should be easy to understand for you and your technicians. So if it all works for you to have it all together in one big list, that's great. The assessor, for a resource, when they show up, they'll just have to look for, the pieces of equipment that are pertinent to the assessment. But if it helps your staff to have, a list that has, a concrete section, a soil section, an aggregate section, and an asphalt mixture section, that's great too. Again, it's kind of what works best for you in your laboratory.
I'm glad you understood that question, because out of context, as someone who's never done an assessment, I was very lost on that. So I'm glad it sounded like that answered that question, because I was like, I don't know what this is even asking. So
hopefully I answered. If not, let us know.
I think it clarified the question itself for me. You answered it. So hopefully that worked out for anything. But we currently don't have any other questions in the question and answers tab. If anybody has anything, feel free to type it in now, or did we just answer all of your questions, that there are no further questions? Maybe, maybe not. Is there anything, Mike or Sonia, that you'd want to add, or that you think maybe new laboratories would be benefit to know? Any like little tips of things as we wait a couple minutes?
I would say the biggest thing is if you are confused or have any questions, we have a contact us page and it has everybody's email addresses and phone numbers. So if you're staring at your computer and you have no idea what the next step is, please don't hesitate to call us. We can walk you through any part of this process and help you get signed up for the test that you need. Yeah, so don't hesitate to reach out.
And in that time, someone did type another question in. So Mike, we'll have you answer this one. During 2020, what is the best way to handle a calibration that's been missed or is out of interval because of 2020?
Yeah, that darn 2020. So the first thing is make sure it is up to date. That's kind of the best way to handle it, is make sure it is currently calibrated. And then if it's a situation where, the laboratory was shut down for X amount of time because of COVID, put a note in your assessment, in your calibration record binder. Laboratory was shut down from this period to this period, or something along those lines. I think it is what it is. We get it. We've seen, we've been around. We've had natural disasters that have disrupted the assessment tour before, and our assessors are understanding. But there might be a finding about that it was missed, but it's okay. At the end of the day, it's okay. It's a good opportunity to kind of look back and think how we can improve things. But if you were shut down for whatever reason, put a note on your records that's why, and chances are that'll be fine for your assessor.
Yes, and in conversations that we've had on the podcast with Brian, similar questions have come up. And in the accreditation realm, I think I can safely say, just document when you had to deviate from your standard procedures. So when you had to deviate from the intervals or things, just document why. And that's generally going to help along the way. But working with your QA after the fact will be a good way as well. But you can ask your assessor whether there's on site or remotely for that. And someone came in and this is being recorded. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post it on our website and on YouTube and on social media, and you'll get an email link to it. You will not be able to get away from this recording. It will follow you wherever you go. Maybe tomorrow, but most likely on Monday or Tuesday, that should be sent out. So our next question, which may be our last question, maybe not. Some of the techs are scheduled for certifications in the upcoming months. If the assessment is scheduled before they get certified, can we submit their certifications later when they receive it? Sonia.
You sure can, and you will actually do that. So if we do your assessment before your technicians are certified, we will have to write up a nonconformity under the corresponding quality system standards. But that will give you a space to upload resolution to that nonconformity, and the resolution will be, look, we got our technician certified. Here's the evidence that they are now certified. So yes, you can upload it later. Remember, our assessments aren't pass fail. We'll write up findings, but it's not an issue of, oh, you got a finding, we can't accredit you, we'll come back later kind of thing. We write up findings and then we give you an opportunity later to fix them.
I think that is a great point and a great reminder, specifically with the Mike's part in the during the presentation, that this is an open book, open note, phone a friend kind of scenario during the assessment. So it's not a gotcha. We're looking for things, but we're not looking to make your life harder than it needs to be, I think. Is there any other questions? Want to get this in? Because I'm not seeing any, so we can wrap it up early, which I don't think anyone would hate, getting 9 more minutes back of their day. No? Okay. Well, if you do have more questions, you can email us and email Mike and Sonya specifically for that, and they will be happy to get the questions. And Renee, I'm sorry. Okay, Renee has one question and we have time, so I'm going to go. We're going to answer Renee's question. If any calibration records are missing due to the inability to get calibration personnel due to COVID, will that be a nonconformity?
No, that will not be. Well, if calibration records, previous intervals are missing, no, that will not be a nonconformity. At most, that would be what we call an observation. So that is something that you do not have to submit documentation proving to us that you have resolved it. It's an opportunity for you to do in-house resolutions. It's still something that deviates from the standard. But I will be honest with you, if you've documented it, it's due to COVID, you had to skip an interval, but now you've got it done and it's up to date. I'm going to not guarantee it, but I'm going to think that your assessor is going to be lenient with you and say, it's okay. This was a major world event. This happened. It was out of your control, and they're not going to write it up at all.
Thank you for that clarification. Sneak in one last question in there. But if you have any other questions, feel free to contact Mike and Sonya or info@ashtoresource.org or lap@ashtoresource.org. We have a lot of different ways for you to get into contact with us. Check out the podcast I've mentioned about that. I will mention it in every future webinar probably as well. And we do have other recordings of webinars that we've done in the past that you may find useful on our website as well and on our YouTube channel. So please go take a look at those resources for you. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day for attending this webinar, and I hope to see you at future events. Our next webinar is scheduled for November 2021. It's about making the most out of the proficiency sample program. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. And thank you, everybody, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.